On today's episode, I'm going to be talking a lot about training methods and training methodologies that really carry over in terms of an aesthetic point of view and then also in terms of a strength and performance point of view. So I'm going to be discussing a few different training methods and styles like powerlifting and CrossFit and more bodybuilding focused hypertrophy training and how that can kind of carry over basing on what your goals are, but obviously to create the most optimal physique in terms of aesthetics and also strength. So this is going to be a pretty cool episode, solo episode today, so tune in. Welcome to the Breakthrough the Bullshit podcast. I am your host, Alice Round. I am pumped to have you here. We are going to really strip back all of the bullshit surrounding nutrition, training, fad diets, everything in the industry so that we can give you education to get the best possible results. So sit back, enjoy the ride, and let's go through all this bullshit. Welcome back, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode. I've been having so much fun with the podcast, and now that I'm back from a bit of travel, I'm getting on top of the episodes and we'll be pumping them out very consistently, and I'm really hoping that you're loving the content thus far. As said, if you ever have any content that you would like covered, I am always open to ideas, so you can always just flick me an email. You can slide up in that DM on my Instagram or my Snapchat or whatever you want to get at me on. Snap's an awesome one to get me on, and my Snap username is @AliRound, same as my Instagram and everything else. So getting to the point of today's topic, we are going to be talking about powerlifting versus CrossFit versus all the different styles of training and the most common and popular methods, and from an aesthetic standpoint what carries over, and then also from a performance standpoint what carries over. So I want to preface this by saying that I personally am giving my own personal opinion from what I have seen that's worked for me and also worked for clients, and then also from research. But I'm saying this is not the be all and end all of gospel, so I'm just prefacing this by saying that because I don't want you to ever think that just because one thing works for one person, it's not going to work for the next. So, and that's kind of how I preach my coaching, in the sense that everyone's going to be different and everyone should be treated as an individual. So whenever you're listening to advice or you're listening to very general advice, always take it with a grain of salt. So what I want to talk about is, I guess, a little bit about, my story and the different training methods I've done. I feel like over the last 10 years of being in the fitness industry, I've probably tried most styles of training. I'm not going to say everyone, because I really think there's a few that I probably haven't done. I haven't really dabbled in Olympic lifting, and that's one of the ones I want to tick off my bucket list at the end of the year, is my goal to try some of that. And I'm lucky that my best friend is a good Olympic lifter, so she can coach me, and I'd like to do an Olympic lifting coaching course just to have another thing to tick off that bucket list, because I think that as a coach it's so important that even if I'm not going to become the next Olympic lifter, that I know about that style of coaching. If a client asks me about it, I'm comfortable answering it. So that's one of the ones that I haven't trialed, probably because, again, from an aesthetic standpoint, it's never really been, you don't do Olympic lifting because you want to change your body shape. It's not why you're going into that sport. And I think that there's a lot going around on social media these days that there's a bigger carryover with powerlifting and bodybuilding or aesthetic-based goals. And you'll see a lot of, Instagram and YouTube celebrities getting more into the powerlifting moves. So heavy periodized squats, dead bench as part of their training regime and looking amazing. People like Nick Cheadle and Lane Norton and, your YouTubers overseas. And I think that it's fantastic that people are getting into more of these lifts. Even girls in Australia like Lauren Simpson and Hattie Boyle and girls that are doing really, really well are incorporating a lot of your big power lifts into their training. Now, I think that that's amazing, but I think that what people need to realize is that that's not their sole focus of their training, and something that I want to touch on today. I believe that through powerlifting, you can create some very positive effects. So through doing specific powerlifting focused training, I believe that you can get some really great aesthetic changes to your body. I believe that you can put on muscle mass really well if you're doing it properly, if you're eating enough calories. I believe that you'll get stronger. That's the whole goal of following any form of periodization. And I believe that mentally you'll become stronger. Your intensity goes up in the gym. You'll learn to train harder. You'll learn to, really push the intensity factor. But the problem being is that powerlifting will have you build muscle mass in certain areas. And this is what I found for me personally. Obviously, I wasn't any form of a professional powerlifter, not that there is any pro powerlifters, but I was not, that fantastic at it. I wasn't too bad. I did my comp and did okay and got some PBs and hit some pretty decent totals for someone in their first comp. But by no means am I saying that I'm a good powerlifter. But, there was a good base, and I spent a good sort of year and a half focusing on that style of training. And the biggest things that I noticed in that time, for me, from an aesthetic standpoint, obviously the reason for me wasn't just aesthetics for doing it, but was that my legs put on a lot of muscle mass, and that was my goal. So I was incredibly happy with the fact that my legs gained size. So in particular, my quads were what I wanted to really grow, and that's why squats I was hitting at a higher frequency than, say, deadlifts. So I put on a lot of mass to my quads. I put on a lot of thickness through my back, which wasn't one of my goals. Definitely deadlifts and bench. I definitely put on some muscle on my shoulders, which was great. Again, one of the goals. From benching twice a week, and then obviously doing bench press accessory movements. And obviously a powerlifting focused style of bench, you are utilizing a lot of deltoids as well as chest, whereas more of a dumbbell press or these sort of things are definitely going to activate the pecs a lot harder than a barbell, big arch, as opposed to, say, like an decline dumbbell press. So they are the big things that I noticed in terms of overall physique change, was definitely the mass to the legs. And I was probably squatting twice a week, benching twice a week, and deadlifting once a week for the majority of like a good year, at least, I would say, doing that consistently. Obviously my strength went up. I went from, struggling to hit, I think 100 kilo squat was kind of like my PB, I think 105. But a real grind and a bit of an ugly lift, as opposed to, a year down the track. And I wasn't really doing structured training for that whole entirety of the year, but probably at least a good 6 months of it, to hitting, a 120 for a double. I did recently a 120 in comp and pretty comfortable. And then my deadlift, I was always using straps, and my deadlift probably going from about a 145, 150 to like a 165 kilo deadlift. And then my bench was probably the one that probably went up the most. I was probably struggling to hit sort of 68, 70 kilos to hitting 77 and 80 on a touch and go on a non-paused. So strength obviously is going to go up because you're focusing on periodization and you're focusing on progressive overload and different things in terms of your training. Now, in terms of body shape, a lot of the time, if you're going to decide to do powerlifting focused training, I think that the major positives with doing it is the fact that you have targets when you go in the gym, and whether your target, your coach sets it based on like an RPE or based on an actual number that you have to hit, or they're giving you different rep schemes. I think that it's amazing mentally because you go in there with a goal and like oh my God, I've got to go up more than what I did last week, and you have to really push yourselves. And I think that for me was fantastic for that year, where I was so busy with business and my personal stuff going on, not personal life, but just busy with stuff that I wanted to do in terms of like looking after my health and hormones and things like that, that for me, switching off and being able to just go in the gym with a plan and a very short program. So I would generally go in and do maybe 3-4 exercises, but a lot more sets than what I would normally do in the past. For me, was mentally refreshing. I did start to get a little bit bored with it coming into like peaking for comp, because then the accessory movements were cut down even more. And I felt like I was starting to get a little bit softer physique wise. My body composition didn't feel as good, and I was eating pretty much the same sort of caloric intake for the entirety of that year. I was eating, over 2,000 calories a day, and obviously I wasn't focusing as much on fat loss, but I did start to feel a lot softer at the end. I did start to feel like I was unfit. That was a big one for me. I've always been someone who's been very fit with my athletics background, and I started to feel so sluggish in terms of cardio abilities because I was doing intensity, and if you don't know what intensity is, it's obviously a lot higher volume, a lot higher weight, lower rep scheme. So you're pushing really high intensities near towards your PB in those final few weeks, usually tapering into a comp. So for me, I started to feel super unfit. I started to feel like I was sore all the time from those higher intensities, started to get little injury niggles, and my lower back started to get a little bit tight, which I never really have problems with because I have quite a strong lower back and good glute activation. And I felt like when I was getting to those higher intensities, I was starting to really try to muscle the weight out, and I wasn't focusing as much on technique and being able to pull back and really focus on form. So there was a lot of pros and cons. I think mentally it pushed me. There was some days where I remember I read my numbers once, and I think I had 110 kilo squats for 4 or 5 reps, and I'd never even been able to, 6 months before that, do that for one. And I went in and did those numbers. So, there's certain things that you get over mentally that you feel really, really proud of. But for me personally, it's probably not something that I'm going to see as something I'm going to be doing long term. For me personally, and I think a lot of women out there, I think it's great to factor those lifts into your regime, and then also build out what type of accessory work you're doing around that. So for example, Katie Ann that I had on the podcast a few weeks back, we discussed it, and I've seen Katie train, and Katie trains a lot more like a powerlifter hybrid bodybuilder, because she does so much accessory work, so she's burning a lot of calories, and that's why she tends to maintain a reasonable body composition. And I think that that's a massive part of it. Obviously, as women, I believe that we don't want to be solely focused on aesthetics, and I think that's why I loved powerlifting. It was about performance, and it wasn't so much driven about how you look. And I think it's amazing for women who are maybe struggling more with their body image and going in with a goal into the gym. I think focusing on powerlifting is going to be amazing for getting your mindset focused on, okay, I just want to be strong, and I want to be fit, and I want to be athletic. And a side effect of that is that you generally look after your nutrition better because you want to train better, rather than, I want to look after my nutrition so that I look better, because that is such a bad mentality around it. And that was a big thing for me when I was powerlifting. It was more like, I need to get calories in because I need to have a good session. I want to eat good food so that it digests well and that I train well. So there's a lot of positives here. So I don't want anyone to think listening that I'm bashing powerlifting, because I freaking love powerlifting. I love watching it. I love the whole sport. But for me personally, it's probably not a sport that I see myself doing long term from an injury and longevity standpoint. I want to be, when I'm 80, able to go into the gym and squat. I want to be able to do all these things later on in life. And I've just seen so many injuries surrounding it, and it's one of those things that if you're going to be an athlete and you're going to do powerlifting as a proper sport, then you need to dedicate time to mobility work, time to physio or chiro, time to massage, time for recovery methods, time for all of these things. And I actually think it requires a lot of time and commitment. Not saying that's something that I wouldn't do, but I just honestly don't have the time for spending enough time to do all that in the gym. Some of my powerlifting sessions were taking me 3 hours, and I might only get through 3 or 4 exercises plus on my mobility work and cool downs and warm-ups. So for me, it's about efficiency as well. And if you're someone that's going to be competitive, then of course that's what an athlete would do. If you're going to be a competitive athlete, it was like when I used to run, we would spend 2.5, 3 hours at the track, and we would spend half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour just warming up, and then we would do our session. Then we would spend another half an hour cooling down. And that's just what you do when you're an athlete and you're in that mindset. But if you're the average gym goer, or above average gym goer, I don't like to call anyone average, and you just want to be a bit stronger, you want to be a bit fitter, you want to be a bit leaner, I don't think that following a specifically powerlifting based program, and I'm talking generalization here, like your general bro powerlifting training, so doing any form of like, twice a week this, twice a week that, just linear sort of periodization, not even DUP, I don't think that it's going to be the best thing for optimal aesthetic, overall fitness, and just overall goals. Because most of the women that email me, the main goals is, I want to be a bit leaner, I want to be stronger, I want to be mobile, and I want to look good in a bikini. So those things, a few of them you'll tick off with powerlifting, but not always. And you'll see some powerlifters who have phenomenal physiques. There's a young guy in WA, Brian, he looks amazing. And I made a joke with Brian once. I said, like, how long do you spend in the gym? Because I've seen one of his workout ones. He spends a good, I'll probably get this wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but a good like 4 to 5 hours sometimes with his gym sessions, because he gets in a lot of volume and a lot of accessory work and trains almost more like a bodybuilder for the last couple of hours of his workouts. Now, a lot of people, again, like I said, don't have that time. So if you're looking at time efficiency in the gym, powerlifting is probably not the best sport for you. If you're a busy mum, or you're a woman out there that works and needs to go train for an hour at 5 a.m. and that's all the time you have in the world, then it's not going to be a case of you doing powerlifting for an hour, because realistically, you're probably only going to, once you've warmed up, only probably get like a few sets of squats in and you're pretty much done. So for me, if I get a client, I always ask them how long they typically can train for, what will work with their lifestyle, and then where we can go to from there. Now, I am not to say that we can't utilize those lifts within a program. I definitely program powerlifting moves in terms of my female clients' programs. I love programming them in. But again, if you chat to someone like a Hattie Boyle or a Lauren Simpson, they're often only hitting those big sort of powerlifting style sessions maybe once a week, and then they're doing a lot of hypertrophy and volume work on the body parts they want to bring up, as well as maybe accessory work to bring up their major lifts. And for me, for example, my squat used to suck because I had no glutes and I had no glute activation to get out the bottom of the squat. So I used to lean forward a lot, use my lower back and my hamstrings because my quads and glutes were quite weak. Then after doing a lot of accessory work, actually focusing on my glutes, my squats went up incredibly without even actually doing a lot of squats. And I would say that's the same, and again, a bit of a generalization, but for a lot of these women, it's not a case of you have to squat more to get better at squats. I don't think it's that simple. I do believe in specificity, but at the same time, if something's not improving for a certain reason, because of biomechanics or because of technique, there's no point like beating a dead horse. Like if your deadlift technique sucks and you just keep deadlifting, and every time you deadlift, you might get a little bit stronger, but all you do is feel it in your lower back, then should you keep deadlifting the same? For me personally, I would say no. And the reason that I say that is because, again, I always go back to training longevity. If I have a client who is deadlifting all from their lower back and they're rounding, and I actually say to them, do you feel your back? And they say yes, then I'll probably fix their technique, make them drop back on weight till they've got good form, they have good control through their lumbar spine, good core strength, all of these sort of things, glutes are firing, and then I'll get them building back up, because there's really no point, messing yourself up just to grind some weight off the floor. And to be honest, it doesn't really impress me when I see someone do an ugly deadlift. I'm like, it's just not something. I would rather see good form. Obviously, as you fatigue and do a 1RM, your form's going to break down a little bit. That's completely normal. But there's a difference between training with ugly form and doing a 1 rep max or like a competition with ugly form. You want to train as close to perfect form as you possibly can to A, reduce injury risk, and B, get your body primed to move that way and get your body used to moving with that fashion, so that when you break down under fatigue, your form is still there as strong as possible. So there are a couple of big things in terms of powerlifting, my likes and dislikes. And again, it comes down to programming. So if you are, say, for example, like I said before, with people like Katie and Brian, they train for long periods of time when they train. Same with Lane Norton. They're doing a lot of accessory work that is going to help with their overall physique. So I know if Katie, for example, does a lot of glute accessory work, she does a lot of quads, a lot of hamstrings, not a lot of quads because she's got more overdeveloped quads. So you're picking the things that you still want to work on in that accessory work. And that's what kind of makes a good powerlifter / hybrid bodybuilder. The people that do a combination of the two. And that's generally what I was doing as well when I was powerlifting, is I was always doing accessory glute work, accessory shoulders, because they were still aesthetically the body parts I wanted to build up, and they're lagging for a reason. And I felt like when I focused on them, the other lifts actually came up too. So I guess what I'm trying to say is not everyone has to be a powerlifter, but it's a good idea to program in those lifts because they are great compounds. And compounds are obviously going to burn overall calories. They're also a good measure of strength. I think it's good to sporadically do strength testing, even if you're not a powerlifter, but you might want to test your squat every 6 to 12 months and even test it for a 5 rep max. It doesn't have to be a 1 rep max. A 5 good form, one good form max. I like to do AMRAP, so I might test the same weight, but I might try to push out more reps, is another way of really quantifying strength. Because at the end of the day, if you want to build muscle mass, you need to progressively overload and be adding more volume. And by testing with AMRAPs and things like that, you'll be able to see if you have been overloading your training. So that's a really, really good one to focus on as well. So I guess it comes down to fat loss versus muscle mass. Personally, if you were trying to build muscle mass, I think incorporating heavy strength movements is fantastic. You get overall, muscle hyperplasia, you get really good cell swelling and development, you get amazing results incorporating strength training to a certain extent, and then also utilizing hypertrophy training, which is really why I like, PHAT training, so power hypertrophy style training, where you're doing a combination of strength and hyper. And that's generally how I like to program for a lot of my clients. It will vary again depending on what their goals are and what body parts we need to bring up. That's why I obviously prefer customized programming. So from a muscle growth standpoint, overall volume increase is important, progressive overload, eating enough calories. They're going to be your 3 key components. So progressive overload, strength and hypertrophy training, as well as enough food, is going to get you some serious gains. Now, in terms of a deficit or dieting, do I still encourage people to do heavy strength training? So do I have, say, my comp clients doing deadlifts a few weeks out from a show, or squats, or whatever the powerlifting move is, bench press? Comes down to the individual. I believe from a fat loss standpoint, it's not necessary to do those lifts, but if strength is still something important to that client, then I believe it's important to keep them in. From a mental standpoint, I believe you can still get stronger while you're in a deficit if you do it right, for at least the most part. You might have some bad days in there, and depending on how low your calories are getting, maybe by the end of prep. I generally sometimes take out the heavier lifts a few weeks out from a client's show. If they are more prone to injury, if they are starting to get very sore and say they're thoracic, and then you've got a pose on top of that, they might be the main reasons for taking them out, just being cautious injury standpoint wise. But that's the same with other movements. Like, there's so many other dangerous moves in the gym than, a bench press. So I will tend to just be a bit more cautious with exercise choice in the final few weeks overall, not just powerlifting moves technically. So yeah, from a fat loss standpoint, I think that they're awesome if you're still progressively overloading, because again, we want to burn more calories. More caloric output is going to help with that. The only big issue as well with when you're dieting, if you're doing a lot of heavy strength training, is recovery. Your recovery will be a factor, so it's going to be harder to recover if you're on less calories overall. So a lot of the time, you will tend to be more sore. You might have to drop the frequency or the volume down a little bit in that case, but it's going to be case sensitive to the individual. Like I said, I like to leave the big lifts in as much as we can, but I might drop the frequency down. I might drop the volume down a touch, but still keep the base in there. There's no reason to have to drop those big lifts out, especially if that client wants to maintain some strength in there. And like I said, it's a great overall compound move. Especially for males, I love to keep heavy bench press in there a couple of times a week. For females, I love to keep your squats and variations on deadlifts. So there's reasons to have certain moves in there, and why I like the hybrid of the strength powerlifting model, and how the two can have a good relationship, but it all comes down to like the right accessory movements as well. Now, in terms of CrossFit from an aesthetic standpoint, I don't even know if I want to go into this today. All right, I'm gonna do it very briefly. Okay, so my views on CrossFit in terms of aesthetics. I think that there's a lot of male CrossFitters out there who look absolutely banging. Have you seen Rich Froning? Like there is some, I remember going to Bali, when we were in Bali for my mentoring, we were there with Lynn and we walked into CrossFit Wanderlust, which is one of the amazing CrossFit gyms in Bali. And I was like, yeah, I'm just going to go do some squats in this CrossFit gym. And anyway, ended up doing the WOD. So died. And if you want to see a video of that, it's on my YouTube. It's really embarrassing. But anyway, I walked in and there were these beasts of women and men in there, like impressive physiques, like jacked, massive traps, back, abs. And they were actually the Reebok team. So the sponsored CrossFitters, I think it's Cara Webb, is it? When the Australian girls was there. And they were jacked. And I was like, fuck, like this is impressive. Now, I am not going to get into a drug and PED talk here because we're all pretty aware that CrossFit is a sport that, generally speaking, a lot of the time there is substances that are used. Again, I'm not going to get into that. I'm definitely not saying that everyone uses them, but there's been some debate around this topic. And for me personally, I think CrossFit is fun. I love doing it occasionally. It's not something that's going to be my sole focus of my training. I've done a few sessions with some of the best CrossFit boxers in Perth, like Dignus and Legion, and those guys know how to program. And like I think Costa and Jem are two of the best probably programmers for CrossFit. Not that I know a massive amount of the others, but I'm just saying that from what I've experienced with them, they know their shit. And I think CrossFit comes down to programming. If you're at a good box, if you have coaches that know how to factor in deloads, factor in recovery weeks, but a lot of the time it's just smashing you day in, day out, which is not so great. So if you're at a CrossFit box and they program really well and really smart, then I think that you'll be safe and looked after in terms of an injury standpoint. But maybe from an aesthetic standpoint, I personally, and again, generalization, I personally felt like for my physique in particular, I'm someone that builds muscle quite well. I tend to already be quite dominant in my traps and my back, that I started to again feel like I was putting on more muscle mass in certain areas that maybe I didn't want it so much. There's a lot of kipping, pulling through the upper traps and shoulders, and again, when you've got good form, those things probably don't happen. So it's making sure you've got good coaching there as well. For guys, CrossFit will tend to build, there's a lot of push press, there's a lot of chest movements. It will tend to focus a lot on building your chest, your shoulders, your back, your traps, and often these are areas that women may not want to get big in. And for a guy, I think CrossFit physique for men, like they look pretty damn sexy, most of them to me, and they have a nice athletic look, in the sense of, moderate level of body fat, not completely shredded like a bodybuilder, but, abs and definition, which I think looks fantastic. And women as well, they get really, most CrossFitters get a good set of abs on them and, nice developed quads, sometimes a bit underdeveloped glutes, because again, we're not focusing in isolation on those body parts. So again, it comes back to like what your goals are, and if you're doing something from an aesthetic standpoint or from a fitness standpoint. For me personally, I like a combination of the two. So I think it's a great idea to incorporate something like CrossFit into your schedule once or twice a week if you want to burn more calories and you're in a deficit, because you burn a shitload of calories in a CrossFit session. And if you're in a deficit, you're going to drop some body fat training that way. So for me, I prefer it more in a deficit standpoint. If I'm more in the case of trying to build muscle, it's probably not the sport I'm going to go to as much, because it's not going to help me build muscle in the areas as much that I want to, if that makes sense. So again, comes down to what you're training for. For athletic performance and overall conditioning and fitness, CrossFit is amazing. I would highly recommend it to any, athletes as well, doing safe CrossFit maybe in their off season from certain sports. It's going to keep them fit. It's going to keep them in shape. So I'm not ragging out any of these sports. I'm just saying my personal opinion from an aesthetic standpoint and from a strength standpoint. I also think with CrossFit, it really helped with my overall strength because I was pushed to do things maybe with AMRAPs or WODs that I wouldn't normally push as much rep-wise in the gym. And then that definitely carried over with my bigger lifts. So even doing EMOMs and things like that on deadlifts were really, really good. The other thing is there's a lot of CNS burnout with both intense powerlifting and CrossFit. probably more so CrossFit, because it's a lot more day in, day out. So that's something that you need to be a bit careful of if you're someone that's maybe had adrenal issues, glandular fever, all these sort of things, that you have a really average immune system and an adrenal function, because it will tend to put a lot of stress on that. So you need to focus then really hard on recovery, eating enough calories, all of these sort of things, if you're going to want to do it more from a competitive standpoint. So that's kind of my little summary on, powerlifting, bodybuilding, CrossFit, these different sports that are really awesome, that all have their individual purpose. But to me personally, I like a combination. That's how I tend to program within my programs like Breakthrough. I love clients to experience different things, so we do a mix. I like to throw in little AMRAPs or WODs or EMOMs as part of workouts, but it might not be the sole purpose of the session. So it might be a combination of a strength move in combination with a few hypertrophy exercises focusing on certain body parts, and then maybe an AMRAP or some form of a WOD for conditioning. And that to me is kind of the optimal workout for a lot of females who, like I said, have that original goal of looking good in a bikini, but being pretty fit, being strong. And that is what I tend to program with my females. So in Breakthrough, this program that I'm running, we do a lot of that. It's really cool. So we give people variety, and that's what I'm all about. So I hope you enjoyed this episode and you got a bit of an insight of my thoughts of kind of the powerlifting world versus bodybuilding world. And kind of talking more about hybrid training. So if you do have any questions on training or on the Breakthrough program, be sure to comment on the podcast. And thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Again, like I said, I love to hear your content. If you're loving it, even put up a post on Instagram, #BreakthroughTheBullshit, and I can see where your posts are at, or if you're getting educated on it, flick me an email. If you want to get me direct, it's alice@aliceround.com. And thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. I'll chat to you legends soon. Thank you for listening to another episode of Breakthrough the Bullshit. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would love it if you could leave a review on iTunes. Let me know, comment what you'd love to see more of, and be sure you've also subscribed on YouTube and iTunes for updates. And if you'd like more info, then you can also add the Team Round Support Facebook page, which is available to access for all of you, and you just simply need to search for it on Facebook.